Hey guys, it's Shara from Woodshop Diaries, and in this video I'm going to show you how I built this sliding door. Now I know that sliding doors can be somewhat controversial for whatever reason, especially when you put them on a bathroom, which I did here. So if you're not a fan, that's fine. The next video will not be a sliding door, so tune in for that. But if you like sliding doors and you want to see how it came together, let's get building. If you saw my sliding door video from last year, you know that I'm not a huge fan of swinging doors. It's not that I don't like doors, I just feel that in many cases they're poorly laid out. This particular door separates the guest bedroom from the attached guest bathroom, and it opens right into the closet door and makes the entrance feel really cramped. So to free up some floor space and give the guest bedroom some character, I decided to add a geometric sliding door to this bathroom entrance. This makes the 5th door I've removed since we've lived here, and trust me, it won't be the last. You'll get to see my door graveyard later in the video, so keep an eye out for that. In the meantime, let's get building. I made this sliding door from a single sheet of 3/4 inch plywood. To figure my sizing, I measured the door opening and added 2 inches on each side and 1 inch on the top. I ripped 2 equal-sized strips off the sheet so that after these were cut, the remaining piece would be the width that I wanted my door. I used these strips to trim the sides of the door later. Then I cut my plywood sheet to the height I wanted my door. This will be the back side of the door. Once that was trimmed to the size that I wanted my door to be, I cut those plywood strips from earlier down to the same height as the door. These will trim out the vertical sides. Maybe these are too wide. I don't know, maybe not. It'll be fine. Everything's fine. So I could cut the long, like vertical frame pieces from the strips that I cut off the plywood sheet, but this is what I have left. And this is plenty of material to cut the pieces for the top and the bottom. The problem is that the grain is running the opposite direction from what I really want it to be, but I don't really want to cut into a whole new piece of plywood. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut these into strips that I can use for the top and the bottom of the door. Just FYI, the grain is running a different direction. I ripped 2 strips from this leftover panel to the same width as the vertical strips, then trimmed them to length so that they would fit perfectly around the edges of the main panel door. These pieces will basically just trim out the sides of the door to make it 1.5 inches thick. Once I made sure everything fit, it was time for edge bending! Because the inside edges of this door are just the 3/4 inch plywood strips, I used 3/4 inch edge banding just on the inside edges. I will edge band the outside edges in a minute. After edge banding was applied along the insides, I sanded everything down, including the back panel, then glued and brad nailed the sides onto the back. Once these pieces were glued and nailed in place, I added 1.5 inch edge banding to the vertical sides of the door. I didn't bother edge banding the top and bottom of the door since these edges won't be seen. After all the edge banding was on and it was sanded once more, I applied a black wood stain to the entire door. If you ever want to know what it's like behind the scenes of being a content creator, here's a glimpse at me trying to film these random, silly transition shots with this door before I added the slats. This is so stupid.
The normal stuff goes on my videos here on YouTube. The weird stuff goes on my videos on TikTok and Instagram. It's honestly so silly sometimes, the things that I get on camera. If you're not following on TikTok and Instagram, feel free to check out the final results of this insanity over on my channels there.
Hopefully that's enough to do something with. I don't know.
Anyway, once the door was stained, it was time to add the slats. This was the fun part. I use these pre-finished solid wood slats from Weber Lumber, and these come in 4-foot pieces. Because these are small pieces, I use some scrap blocks clamped on the miter saw to make a kind of fence to help keep the pieces from flying out the back. I literally just made up some kind of design here. I knew that I wanted to keep the angles at 45 and 90 just to minimize waste, so first I just cut a slat to run across the diagonal at one of the top corners. I glued and brad nailed this first piece in place, then just kind of laid out some pieces to come up with a design. These slats are 1/4 inch thick, so I just used pieces of the slats as spacer blocks throughout this whole project. Because I wasn't sure exactly what I was doing here, I just marked and cut a few slats at a time to lay them out before gluing and nailing in place. I casually worked my way down and around the door, cutting pieces and just laying them out with 1/4 inch spacing between each one. Once I glued several pieces on one way, I switched and turned them the other way for a few more pieces. My best advice here is to get creative and cut a few pieces at a time to lay out and make sure you like how it's going before gluing and nailing. A lot of the pieces that I've laid out here aren't nailed in place yet. They're just laying there to give me a visual to see if I like the spacing. Things were going pretty well until I was putting these pieces on, and I got to this board and I thought, I don't think I want to run all of these this way all the way to the end. I want to turn them and I want to go this way. Well, I got really excited because I had this tiny little piece scrap, and so I started with it because it just fit perfectly in here, and I nailed it in place, and then I started working my way this way, and then I got to this board and I realized I should have started here and worked my way that way, because now the gaps aren't even and this board's already nailed in place. So now I have these 4 boards here that they fit, but the gaps are clearly not equal, and these are already glued. And I tried to take a rubber mallet and try to tap them, but they're not budging. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna actually take these to the bandsaw, and I'm gonna rip like 1/8 of an inch off of each one. That will just give me some wiggle room here to space these out to where they look at least even, and you're not gonna instantly notice that those gaps aren't the same. I could also use a table saw, but cutting tiny pieces on the table saw freaks me out, so I'm gonna use the bandsaw. Mistakes happen, you just have to figure out how to fix them. Okay, maybe you'd notice that a little, but it's not nearly as bad. So I think we're just gonna deal with it and just take that as a lesson learned. I continued working my way around the door until I had the very last piece glued and nailed in place. I tried to use up every little piece that I could here, and I ended up having only a small scrap pile left over. Not too bad. But for now, the door was finished up, and I shifted gears to work on the door trim inside the house. Last year, when I built my library desk project, I had a sliding ladder on it, and I used a 12-foot long rail system. Before I bought the 12-foot long, I thought I was gonna make the library bookshelf wider, so I bought a 14-foot long double door sliding rail system. I didn't want to have to ship it back. It was going to be more expensive than it needed to be, so I just kept it. And what I did was I used half of it for my sliding laundry room door that I built last year, and I'm going to use the other half for this door. So I have a 7-foot long rail. So the trim piece that goes above the door needs to be about 7 foot long. I grabbed a 8-foot 1x4, and I'm just going to cut a foot off of it and then put that as my top trim piece, and that'll be what I mount the actual sliding rail onto. The top of the door trim needed to be replaced with a longer board in order to mount the rail to, so I cut a 1x4 to the same length as my rail, sanded it, and then brought it into the house. Before nailing it on, I used a stud finder to find and mark the studs so that 1, I knew where to nail the trim, and 2, I knew where to drill the holes for the rail. After the 1x4 was nailed on, I puttied the nail holes, and after the putty dried, I sanded it smooth, and between coats of primer and paint on the new trim, I headed back to the shop to prepare the door. I will link the sliding door hardware kit that I used here below, but it comes with these rollers to mount to the door. And the instructions tell you where to mount the holes for them, but I like to just drill the top one first and then drill the bottom one once the rollers are in place.
7/16 holes. Why don't I have 7/16? I have half and 3/8. I'm gonna go with half.
It calls for using a 7/16 drill bit, but all I had was a 3/8 and a 1/2 inch, so I used a 1/2 inch. I drilled 1/4 inch holes first to make things a little easier, then drilled out the 1/2 inch hole. I used the included hardware to secure the roller to each side, but do note that I actually installed these backwards. The nut that I put on the bottom was supposed to go on the top. Not a big deal, but I did notice this later and had to switch them, so just pretend that these are flip-flopped. Once the rollers were in place, I drilled out the second hole, this time with a 3/8 inch bit because the 1/2 inch wouldn't fit through the hole. It worked fine, but the bolts were a little tight, so I had to twist them in. Now I realized that when the door is closed on the bathroom, there's no handle or knob to open it up from the inside. So I used a Forstner bit to drill out a shallow hole on the backside. There isn't enough clearance between the door and the door trim to add anything that really sticks out too far, so a hole is a good option. I didn't want to drill too deep because I didn't want to go through the plywood, but a shallow hole is really all you need. You could stain this to match the door, or install some cup hole hardware, or just glue on a thin piece of a wooden dowel as a shallow knob. Anyway, by this point the paint on the door trim inside was dry and I could install the rail to get this finished up. The instructions told me what height to drill the holes based on my door height. I had already marked the stud locations prior to installing the trim piece, so I just marked the height to drill at on each stud. But I drilled out only the middle hole to start with. I snugged the rail on the middle first and then made sure all my marks lined up on an actual hole, so I didn't drill these in the wrong place. One note to take here is that when installing the rail, it can either push the trim out a little in the process or pull the trim tighter. I learned that lesson when installing the rail for my laundry room last year. So while I did paint the trim before installing the rail, I waited until after it was installed to caulk it. I got them all snug first, made sure it was level, then I tightened them all the way. Also note that after I installed this, I changed my mind, took it down, flipped it over, and reinstalled it the other way. Since I was using half of a 14-foot rail and not the actual 7-foot rail, the holes aren't centered on the rail, so the end was sticking off too far and I just didn't like how it looked. And after the trim was caulked, I was ready to hang the door, but first, my favorite part, I got to rip off this old door. Once it was off, I carried it to this closet that's kind of become like my little door graveyard. It's getting full and I should probably get rid of them at some point, but not today. Now that the old door was gone, I carefully but excitedly placed the new door on the rail. This kit comes with these stoppers that you place on the end of the rail to prevent it from sliding off. I tightened the one on the left, but before adding the one on the right, I installed the floor guides. This kit comes with these little guides to help keep the door from swinging back and forth. However, the holes in the bottom are for screwing them into the floor. Since we're on a concrete slab, I didn't want to drill holes for these, so I found some double-sided mounting tape and decided to give these a try. Because the tape is kind of thick, I wasn't able to put these underneath the door like they're supposed to be installed, but I could turn them the other way and this worked perfect. I taped one guide at the back and one guide at the front, making sure that the door could fit between them and glide smoothly.
Then I adjusted the right side stopper on the rail so that the door wasn't able to slide past these guides. At that point, the door was ready to roll. Pun intended. I'll figure out a lock for this eventually, but right now no one actually uses this bathroom, and if they do, they can just lock the bedroom door. So I know that somebody's going to ask what I did about the holes in the door frame that were left from the existing door. I will cut some 1.5 inch wide strips to simply glue and nail on both sides of this door frame. If you didn't want to cut your own pieces of 1.5 inch wide trim, you could just grab some like lattice trim, 1/8 of an inch thick or 1/4 of an inch thick. Just glue and nail onto these and then kind of smooth out and putty the gaps. If you do think that you might want to add the old door back later at some point, you might skip the glue and just nail those pieces in. That way you can pull them off easily if you ever need to put the door back on. I'm not doing that yet because at some point I'm going to come back and redo this bathroom. I always try to, in my mind, make the cutoff the door frame. So this front half of the door frame will be for this project and the back half of this door frame will be for the bathroom project, because if I don't draw the line at some point, this will be a never-ending project. It'll like spill over into this room, it will spill over to the door trim here, which will spill into painting this room, which will spill into all the things. So I have to draw the line at some point, and so I'm drawing the line here at the middle of the door frame. And that's a wrap on this project. I'll be revisiting this space, both the bedroom and the bathroom, at some point, so if you stick around, you'll probably see this door again. But I hope you enjoyed watching it come together, even if you aren't a fan of sliding doors. If you want to keep up with all the latest projects and plans, be sure to subscribe to the channel. And until next time, friends, happy building!